Everyone. I see people are trickling in, but for the sake of time, I'll get going. Thanks everyone for being here today. This is a webinar presented by the Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman Group, along with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. And although we're meeting virtually, we'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, this has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and more recently the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're very grateful to have the opportunity to work in this land. My name is Colin West. I'm a postdoc researcher at Rotman, and I'll moderate the webinar today. Today, we're delighted to have Varun Gauri with us. In this webinar, he will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. And during the presentation, you can submit questions by clicking on the Q&A tab in Zoom and typing in your question. And then at the end of the talk, I'll select from the Q&A tab and pose these questions to our speaker. So I'd now like to introduce Varun. Varun is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and a lecturer of public and international affairs at Princeton University. Previously, he was an economist in the World Bank's research department, where he founded and headed the World Bank's behavioral science unit, MBED. His current research addresses behavioral economics, human rights, and social policies in developing countries. So thanks for being here, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Colin. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to have the opportunity to speak to you all about the topic of cosmopolitanism. Always a relevant topic, but particularly so these days, as we may discuss in the next hour or so. Let me see if I can share my screen to get us going. Can you all see that? Yeah?
Yeah, also.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned, I want to talk about cosmopolitanism, and I should distinguish between what we typically think of as cosmopolitanism, say the cultural side from the moral side. On the cultural side, you might think of someone as cosmopolitan if they've traveled to Bali, or they like to go out to interesting restaurants, or they dress in a certain way. That's one aspect of cosmopolitanism, kind of an interest and engagement with people from around the world. What I want to emphasize is the moral dimension. And this concerns questions like who around the world should get priority access to COVID vaccines, should taxpayers in rich countries compensate citizens in poor countries for climate change, how important is it to avoid civilian casualties during foreign wars. There's a series of questions in policy domains which implicate a moral side of cosmopolitanism, that is, valuing each human life equally or significantly. As I'll develop later on and present some evidence on, these two sides of cosmopolitanism aren't necessarily correlated. You might think about people who've traveled all over, businessmen or military or missionaries who have a lot of knowledge of foreign cultures, but may or may not have certain views that correlate with people who are concerned about equal well-being around the world. To get us going, I thought that we might do a little bit of a poll to just take your pulse on some of these questions. Is it possible to put that poll up? I think you'll have a chance to answer that now, while I tell you a little bit about how this project got started and how it worked. I see it there, so please go ahead and fill it in. So the project is this collaborative work with Shuchen Zibai at Princeton and Susan Fisk at Princeton. When I was at the World Bank, Susan was presenting her work on stereotype threat, her stereotype content model. And we began a discussion about some of the challenges we faced at the World Bank, right? So at the World Bank, our mission is to eliminate global poverty, mitigate global poverty. And we often come across the problem that, in the rich countries, global poverty is less of a priority than one would like it to be, whether it comes to climate change or trade policy or secret tax havens or any host of issues. How can we get people to become more morally cosmopolitan in that way? That was the question that we started discussing. And we realized, we don't necessarily have a good measure of this quality in people. and we don't really know what to do about it all that much. So that we began a series of conversations and led to a few years of work with Susan and Bai. So let me see if I can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I want to tell you a little bit about, the concepts, so the results of our study, and some future directions that this work could take. When it comes to concepts, the key idea here is that we're really interested in the distinction between tribal loyalty, your loyalty to your group, to your country, to your family, to your ethnic group, versus universality. And in some ways, that's received widespread attention in the literature, right? We know there's been work on parochial altruism, parochial cooperation, parochial trust, and empathy. So we know that people prefer their own in lots of different decision-making contexts. We know that from experience. There's lots of work from psychology and economics that backs this up. What we want to do is say, morality exists not only, you yourself, am I a good person? Not only you with respect to a friend, am I going to, or someone or a stranger, am I going to donate in the dictator game a certain amount of money to this person or not? It exists in whether you cooperate with your group as a member of a group, but it also exists between groups. That's a somewhat different phenomenon. And the relationship between groups can be one of moral patriots or one of moral cosmopolitans. In the patriot paradigm, you prefer your own group when it comes to intergroup decisions, intergroup allocations. In moral cosmopolitanism, you prefer your own group less, let's put it that way. Now, what's also distinctive about the nationalist side of this question, as opposed to an ethnic group or a racial group or a gender, say, is that it's potentially morally compelling. I mean, there are reasons why you might want to, morally speaking, prefer your own country. Rawls, for instance, makes this argument. Many others have made this argument that, sharing laws, having a society that cooperates together creates moral obligations. Even setting aside the question of ethnicity and saying we have the same skin color or the same religion, which are more morally questionable for preferring your own group, just saying you cooperate together might create moral obligations. So unlike some of these other kinds of intergroup decisions or moral questions, this question of own country versus nation is a real moral question, and we want to see how people think about it. Now, there is a lot of work. There are existing measures of cosmopolitanism. You have there are things out there in the literature like a social dominance scale, identification with all humanity, the moral foundations work of Jonathan Haidt and others. There's the utilitarianism scale. There's something called the moral circle. So there's a variety of psychometric tools to get at this question. However, we believe that our approach is distinctive for the following reasons. First, it uses salient groups, your own country versus the world, which many of the others do not. It involves trade-offs. Our questions involves trade-offs, because that is exactly what comes up when you think about whether to allocate resources or donate vaccines, say, to Africa or something like that. It's also, it involves moral reasoning, not identity. This gets back to the point I was making at the beginning about moral versus cultural cosmopolitanism. In moral cosmopolitanism, you can have a belief about the fairness of distributing COVID-19 vaccines equitably, for instance, while still never having traveled to another country, while still not necessarily knowing that much about what goes on, let's say in Botswana or something. But even not knowing that, you can, through your own beliefs and moral reasoning, think that fairness requires fair distribution or things like that. And then finally, we use contextualized decisions. By that, I mean referring to specific policy domains and also certain kinds of action, and I'll get at that in a minute. So let me now turn a little bit to some of our empirical results and our strategy and tell you a little bit about what we found. We started with representative surveys in 8 countries, total sample size of over 7,000. These samples in Spain, UK, Germany, China, Japan, the US, Colombia, and Guatemala were representative on all available demographic observables. We started to develop our scale with 81 items, and then asked people to respond to these Likert style questions. Then to extract latent dimensions, we randomly split samples into exploratory and confirmatory for each country and did a multiple group factor analysis. We validated the scale in a variety of ways, which I won't go into, and ultimately came out with two key factors, emerging from the scale. The scale, eventually we whittled down to 9 questions. The two factors we labeled equitable benefit. For example, citizens in our country should accept a reduction in their standard of living if doing so increases global equality. And equitable security. For example, it is as bad when terrorist attacks happen elsewhere as when they happen in our nation. So the 5 items in the equitable benefit scale are about allocating resources. The 4 items in equitable security scale are about how much people deserve protection from harm. And you can see the relationship between these two factors, which we did not anticipate prior, but which fell out of our scale, fell out of the data. They're kind of related to psychological concepts of approach and avoidance, right? Sort of like approaching, giving resources, avoiding, not causing harm. Also related to, the human rights literature on positive rights and negative rights and things like that. So before I tell you what we found, is it possible to get the results from the quick poll that we just had? So basically, what we're finding, I think you're seeing the results there. Was it possible to get summaries of the data?
Yes, I just need a few more minutes, Varun, to get the.
Okay, all right. Let me tell you what we found in our data, and then we can hear a little bit about what you all think. So here are the results for our 8 countries. You can see the equitable benefit is in blue, equitable security is in red. The basic finding is that for equitable benefits, on a scale up to 6, the average result is 3.5 or so. For equitable security, that approaches the ceiling. We're getting up towards 6, except maybe for Japan. So what we're finding basically is that when it comes to equitable security, the large majority of people feel pretty strongly about it. They believe, as moral cosmopolitans, that we should avoid civilian casualties. People are equally deserving of harm protection. When it comes to the allocation of resources side, whether, for instance, our country should reduce its standard of living to benefit people around the world or to promote global equality, the majority are above average, but not that much above average. So people are strongly moral cosmopolitan when it comes to equitable security, somewhat morally cosmopolitan when it comes to equitable benefits. Although I should add that when it comes to equitable benefits, this is kind of more than you might think, right? I mean, most people are sort of split on this question. And that might be different than what you would anticipate just scanning the headlines, right? Where you see things like America first, Russia first, India first, China first. The sense is out there that we're not living in that kind of world, but we find that people are supportive, which suggests, for instance, that populism and related political trends are possibly supply side phenomena rather than demand side phenomena. In the privacy of their computer screen, people are willing to endorse moral cosmopolitanism if you put aside the screaming pundits and the framing and all that kind of thing. So I think that's one of our interesting and key findings, which is and potentially optimistic. Any results on the respondents on the panel, on the audience yet?
Not quite. I have, so for the first one, we have an average of 2 for question 1.
Mhm.
And I'm still working on the other 4, but I will get back to you as soon as I can.
Okay, just let us know. So then we wanted to see, does this scale correlate with real things, right? And so we correlated it with attitudes. It found that equitable benefits strongly predicts support for overseas development assistance, for greater immigration, for support for national organizations. Equitable security strongly predicts endorsement of rules that ban corruption on the part of domestic companies when operating overseas, stronger support for workers' rights, and strong support for reducing carbon footprints. We also looked at whether the scale results and these 2 factors are correlated with a variety of other variables that we collected. Basically no correlation with demographics, which was somewhat surprising, gender, race, social class. One of the key findings out there in the literature is that political orientation is related to willingness to support overseas causes, support for overseas development assistance, things like that. We found that political orientation was weakly correlated with our results here, which was interesting and consistent with what I was just saying a second ago. Trait empathy, it's not that we're picking up people who are just more empathic, right? We looked at a couple other scales that are out there, the identification with the world, small correlation, and the utilitarianism scale developed at Oxford. There's a medium correlation on one of the 2 factors, but not on the other. So we think we have something distinctive here that's not being picked up on the other scales. Also, interestingly, we had a question there about whether you've traveled overseas, and that was not correlated with the scale either. So we're picking up something in the mind and not just experiential and not just cultural, in the survey. Okay, so that correlates with attitudes. What about actual decisions? So we wanted to see if world cosmopolitans behave differently. So we set up an online experiment in which respondents, a different set of respondents, were asked to make a choice between donating money. In some cases, they could keep some of the money, it was $1, for themselves, or donate, in other cases, they had to donate the full $1, allocate it equally between Teach for your country, whether it's America or another country, the national equivalent, and Teach for the World. These are real NGOs. And what we found is that the equitable benefit dimension was strongly predictive of willingness to donate to Teach for All. Somewhat less in Colombia, but strongly in the UK and then, in Japan. And in other countries as well. And then we set up a hypothetical trolley dilemma. You might know this from the philosophical literature. In the philosophical literature, it's a measure of utilitarianism where you're sort of standing on top of a bridge. A trolley is coming to hit some people and there's someone standing on the bridge. If you push one person off the bridge, you can, divert that trolley or stop the trolley and save 5 people. Are you willing to do it? Classical utilitarianism would say, of course you do it. 5 lives are worth more than 1. But we modified it a bit where the person you're pushing is an immigrant and the people you're saving are middle-class citizens to sort of make the equitable security dimension about your nation versus all, particularly salient. And we found, again, generally speaking, pretty strong prediction that people who scored high in equitable security, that were more cosmopolitan, were less likely to push that immigrant off the bridge. We also looked at a question about COVID, in the COVID context. People were asked to basically click, kind of not actual tweets, but online retweets, support for petitions. We then told them and did send a petition to Congress on behalf of the outcome that was the most supported. They could support either masking the world or masking Americans. And similarly, they can support vaccinating the world or vaccinating Americans. And what we found was that although political orientation did predict cosmopolitanism, when you added, this is just like before, when you add the dimensions in our scale, political orientation became insignificant and equitable benefit predicted masking the world, equitable, and both equitable and equitable security was correlated with vaccinating the world. So far what we've shown is that there is something called moral cosmopolitanism that's correlated with a number of attitudes towards international policy. It predicts donation behavior, predicts behavior in a hypothetical experiment, and it also seems to be correlated with attitudes toward or behaviors toward in COVID for promote its support for masking and vaccines around the world. Now, what's going on in the minds of moral cosmopolitanisms? Like, what are they thinking? What are they saying? So we asked them after they made their donation decisions, this is a different sample, what was going on, right? So we asked them, please tell us briefly why you decided as you did. And they would just write down, and they wrote down a variety of things. And then we used natural language processing and put in what are called attention weights on various words, preserving the sequence of the words, using this as a software package out there to identify which words and which phrases, which arguments were correlated with which kinds of behavior. So for instance, if you say something like America first, you're sort of like much less likely to be cosmopolitan. Those two words seem to be equally significant, America and first, in the donation decisions. If you say something like the world needs more education, that's much more likely to be morally cosmopolitan, with a term like the world being and education being particularly important in driving that, that decision. So we asked people, tell us what's going on. And you can see that when they say things like, I believe in taking care of our own citizens before the rest of the world, they're much more likely, unsurprisingly, to have been donating to Teach for America rather than Teach for the World. Charity begins at home. Charity starts at home. We should put our own house in order first. And then, people that are split say things like, because both have the same, or the world can reach more people. You're becoming increasingly cosmopolitan when people say things like, I see humanity as a whole, not divided into country. You can see that the level of education in Germany would be increasing, has a direct influence on it. International research, and the world again. So after looking at this and puzzling over the results of this for some time, it turned out that the thinking process of moral cosmopolitans and the thinking process of moral patriots is somewhat different, and particularly along the three dimensions. The first is, the scope of concern, whether it's our own or country or say America or Germany or whatever, or Colombia, Spain, Guatemala, or the world, right? There was also a difference when it came to prioritization. People who were patriots tend to rank, right? This first, then, later, whereas the cosmopolitans tended to be less concerned with ranking and more saying both or equality and things like that. And then finally, when it comes to the policy domain or the activity, the patriots tended to frame it in terms of charity. That kind of term came up a lot. Education or the substantive need came up more for the cosmopolitans. So we thought, okay, so we think we know a little bit about the thought process that distinguishes cosmopolitans from patriots. Let's see if we can use this to drive behavior. So in a sample of American participants, about 1,000 of them, we did an experiment in which we asked people, we primed them basically with the words world, both, and education on the one hand, that's the cosmopolitan nudge, and our own first and charity, which is the patriot nudge, in the between subjects design. We also were interested in whether this sort of, the kind of encouragement might make a difference. So we distinguished between people who are asked to just list pros and cons, about, these terms versus people that would tell a personal story. The outcome of interest was donation proportion to international organizations. And we didn't just use education, we used 6 different ones so that we wouldn't, to try and eliminate experimenter effects, and to see what we got. So here's sort of an illustration of what people saw. They were asked to sort of like, they were told that the following statements are from previous participants choosing between nonprofits working for education. After reading their statements, please write your own thoughts. Please give us your personal story or pros and cons. And then they wrote things like, I think providing education across the world is more important than Americans. That someone might respond, we need to help our own country first after reading that. And then they were sort of, given, some of these sliders and asked to sort of allocate a real donation to one of these organizations. What we found, basically, no difference between the encouragement design and the sort of the pro and con design and the personal story design. But people who got the Cosmopolitan nudge donated about 50% to Cosmopolitan causes. People who got the patriotic nudge donated 38%, significant difference. In a different sample, our baseline number was 36% giving to Cosmopolitan organizations. So relative to this sample and relative to baseline from another sample, we find that the Cosmopolitan nudge seems to work. So it's possibly the case that when you motivate people or prime them to think about cosmopolitanism and moral cosmopolitanism with the key concepts that seem to be at play when people are making this kind of choice, you can get them to behave in a cosmopolitan manner, at least in the very short term. So let me say a couple of words just to sort of wrap up before we go to questions, to tell you a little bit about what we found, and say a couple of words about where else this agenda might go. So what we find is that moral cosmopolitanism is somewhat widespread, certainly more widespread than I think many of us might have guessed reading the headlines. As I mentioned earlier, it may be the case that, and I think Danny Roderick actually makes an argument like this at a certain point, that populism is at least partly a supply side phenomenon, or one in which demand follows supply. And privately, people remain cosmopolitan. This kind of altruism is available. It's kind of consistent, actually, with some of the findings out there in the psychological literature, in which in intergroup allocation games, the best choice is often the choice that benefits the in-group but does not harm the out-group. People typically prefer that to an outcome that benefits the in-group and harms the out-group. So there's this sort of potential for cosmopolitanism, for not harming at least, that those experiments find, and that our scale, I believe, finds support for or is consistent with. So we also find that international policy attitudes and real world behaviors are correlated with this moral cosmopolitanism. Moral cosmopolitanism is weakly correlated with identities, having traveled, demographics, and things like that. Moral cosmopolitans have distinct thought processes relative to moral patriots. They tend to use different concepts for the group they think about, for the activity that they're engaging in, whether it's sort of a response to human needs or something, a charity. Sort of like the charity framing is sort of like about the donor. The need framing is about the recipient, and that seems to be important. And we also find that there are effective short-term interventions that can make people morally cosmopolitan, more morally cosmopolitan, at least in the short term. So there's a number of questions that that remain. We want to know a little bit about, where does this arise from? How stable is it? Why exactly is it weakly correlated with political liberalism? I mean, a lot of the qualitative studies, for instance, if we look at the establishment of the UN and, the Marshall Plan and, the post-World War II political agenda of, the international liberal order, you find that political liberalism was strongly correlated with that action. Not entirely sure why it's weakly correlated in our survey, apart from the simple definitional fact that we sort of abstract from political contexts. And what would be like a medium to a long-term nudge rather than a short-term nudge, of course, it would be of great interest. So if I were still at the World Bank and sitting over there and I were talking to my old self, what would I say in terms of the actions that an organization like the World Bank or the international development community engages in? Well, to begin with, it may be the case, and this is an argument developed by John Barron and Joshua Green some time ago, that patriotism is a kind of social norm. It may be the case that people aren't naturally patriotic, but they kind of think they should be because the people around them are. This is a little bit like the supply side phenomenon I was describing. I mean, moral cosmopolitanism, maybe, in there, we got to find a way to sort of get people to make it available to get to that tipping point. I might also say that, when it comes to trying to get people to engage in a more morally cosmopolitan fashion, it may be useful to frame messages in terms of equitable security or avoiding harm. If you recall the two dimensions of our scale, equitable security and equitable harm, there's very widespread support for equitable security, sort of mixed support for equitable benefit. So if you can frame things in terms of avoiding harm, you might be able to leverage that latent support for moral cosmopolitanism. And it's actually not hard to do so. If you think you can talk about climate change in terms of either the harms being done to small island nations and countries that are low-lying poor countries, or you can talk about in terms of an allocation resource problem. The former may get more interest. It's also the case that a variety of economic policies might be framed this way. The harm that bad labor conditions cause on individuals, the harm of tax havens for a variety of governance issues in countries like Russia, for instance. A third thing I might say to my old self, if I was still at the World Bank, would be maybe we're thinking about avoiding the charity frame. A lot of times organizations, NGOs in particular, will talk about, okay, let's give more, let's give, let's donate, let's make a difference. That may prime attention on the giver rather than the recipient. There are other arguments for this as well out there, and that might be something to keep in mind. And then finally, the bank and organizations like it, are engaged in all these rankings, like the doing business indicators or the human development indicators or even GDP per capita, that are all ranked. And that may be priming that ranking phenomenon, if you remember, us, first versus the world, first versus all. That distinction may be relevant in terms of priming people to behave in a patriotic or cosmopolitan manner. And we may want to play down that a bit. Of course, when you rank things, you get, a lot of status competition and you get motivate behavior. So there's a trade-off here, but it may have the perhaps unintended consequence of priming patriotism rather than nationalism when it comes to moral decision-making. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Thanks, Varun. That was fantastic. There's a few questions coming in. I'll start by posing a couple of my own. One I just wanted to start with is you focused on countries as the level of analysis here. Do you think the same kind of research would expand to how people define their in-group? Some people might define their in-group as their kind of local church or synagogue or mosque community. Others might define it much more broadly in terms of maybe their political affiliation within their country. So I wonder how you think about country as being the right way to analyze this. And then kind of, building on that, how do our in-groups expand or contract? Sometimes we might think of our in-group very narrowly, and other times, we might think of it very broadly. I'm a citizen of humanity, or, I'm thinking much more broad. Anyway, I wanted to think about how flexible you think those are, and whether you think country is the right level.
Yeah. So thanks, Colin. So I don't think country is necessarily the only group to focus on. I mean, I think it's distinctive in important ways, though. The first is that I think it's morally defensible in a way that, skin color, say, isn't, or even gender isn't, or even political party. Like if I'm trying to just allocate resources, vaccines, I can't really make an argument they should focus on people of a certain skin color, a morally defensible argument. I can't make an argument they should only focus on one gender or, on one religion. I can, although I disagree with it, I think it's a defensible argument to say that you should prioritize your own country first because you have laws together, you're democratically, supposedly self-governed, you tax, there's taxation, which creates obligations. And so I think it's a morally plausible argument. And I think I think for that reason, this style of research that we were engaged in which we're interested in the reasoning and the thought process, may be more suitable for the nation versus world decision than it is for others. Certainly for something like race, you wouldn't necessarily, that's really about a visceral, prejudice, a discomfort, a stereotype, a label that's not morally defensible. And so some of these other scales that are developed, things like identification, social dominance, those kinds of scales might be more relevant to the other in-groups and out-groups relative to the one that, that we develop. And your second question, Colin, if I remember right, was about, movement, among these things, right?
Yeah, there's some, I'll point out one kind of interesting research on how when people are really economically stressed, they tend to narrow their attention and moral concern towards their more immediate in-group. Whereas when they're less stressed, they kind of are able to broaden their kind of empathetic sphere. And there's one kind of an individual difference that can focus my attention. I really want to protect my in-group, when resources are scarce, versus I can expand my empathy when I'm feeling less stressed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we abstract from that kind of question. We sort of look at just one point in time. We don't have a time series. And if you look, for instance, at the data on overseas development assistance, you find that, consistent with what you're saying, it goes down during recessions. So in 2008, it went down, 1998, it went down. And so when the rich countries are stressed, right, through, a recession, they're less generous, and economically speaking, you want to be anti-cyclical, right? You want to sort of that's the time you want to give more, but that's not what happens. And possibly there's a mechanism like you're describing where the concern really turns inward during those events like that.
Yeah, and that would predict not less generosity in total, but less generosity outside of how I define my in-group, right? Like I might be more generous within my kind of local sphere.
Yeah, I don't actually know the data on that, but I wouldn't be surprised if, say, look at the COVID recession, right? You had at least in the US and Europe, you had a lot of domestic spending, very high levels in the US, and less generosity overseas. So I think, I don't know the overall, I don't know the actual data in terms of adding it up, right? Sort of whether it's the overall pie is the same, but it's reallocated more internally, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case.
Switching gears a little bit, Tim Dirksen had a really interesting question here about the way you're thinking about framing equitable benefits versus equitable security. So he mentioned that equitable benefits asks about lowering your standards, right? Whereas equitable security is asking more questions about is it a bad thing? Is it morally wrong? And his question related to whether they seems like a loss versus a neutral frame. How might you think about whether you're thinking about losing something versus having a neutral frame?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm not exactly sure if one of these survived in our final scale, but you can think about equitable harm in terms of losing something too, in the sense that when you are engaged in a military action, when your military forces are avoiding civilian casualties puts your own pilots, say, at greater risk, right? It takes, setting aside drones and modern warfare, for the most part, it takes extra energy and time, and it exposes you to greater risk to sort of really make sure, for instance, there are no, civilians, sadly, women, children recently has been in the news. You have to sort of investigate and potentially expose yourself to risk to do that. Similarly, if you have a law that prevents your own companies from engaging in bribery overseas, relatively recent phenomenon in many countries, that loses income for your co-nationals, right? Profits anyway for those companies, potentially. So I think it's the case that equitable harm also involves trade-offs. I mean, we designed it that way. I think the question that I shared did not include that, but conceptually, I think they're related.
And on a similar note, you've focused squarely on redistributing resources here. But if you think of another type of fairness that people really care about, which you might call procedural fairness versus redistributive fairness, how do you think that might play in here? Do you think moral cosmopolitans also care a lot about procedural fairness? To give a more concrete example, you might think of procedural fairness of we're all playing by the same rules. We're not a richer country isn't exploiting the resources of a poorer country. Maybe if I really care about procedural fairness, I don't actually feel like I'm obligated to give resources to that poorer country, but I do feel a really strong obligation not to exploit them. We're at least all playing by the same set of rules, and we can compete on that ground. That would be kind of a very laissez-faire capitalistic way of thinking about this. The rule set needs to be fair, but I don't need to actually distribute resources.
Yeah, I think the way that you took that, sort of half answered that yourself, Colin. Sort of that sort of is my intuition as well. Which is that procedural fairness is really about respect and dignity. If I sort of decide, if I, as the state, arrest you, I need to give you due process. I need to sort of possibly give you access to a lawyer, and that's respecting your dignity and freedom as a person. And I think that the equitable harm dimension is related to that. It's about that kind of not harming you, not depriving you of your liberty, not depriving you of your life, not depriving you of, the freedom of speech, things like that, the ability to govern yourself as a country, or, democratic rights, not depriving you of those sort of, natural rights kinds of things, both rooted in a certain kind of, dignity and respect for persons. So I would suspect that a proceduralism, I know this is conjecture, but a proceduralism score along these lines would look a lot like the equitable harm dimension that we described for the reasons that you started to outline. Yeah.
On a related note, I'm sure you're familiar with some of the work on. I'll say Paul Bloom has a really interesting book called Against Empathy, where he makes the strong case that we shouldn't be making our moral decisions based on how empathetic we feel towards a victim or group, versus the very calculative, deliberative approach of effective altruism. So do you think how might that dimension line up here? Do you think moral cosmopolitans have a broader sphere of empathy and they can be really empathetic, or are they acting more like effective altruists, where they're saying this is a much more rational calculation that I'm making of all human lives are equal. I'm not thinking of who pulls on my heartstrings. I wonder how you think about that, and whether there are individual differences in that, or whether that might be, again, a supply side of some people just really buy those arguments, and it's less emotional, more rational and calculative.
Yeah, I think I would lean in that direction. I think I'd agree. I mean, I think Bloom and others make the argument that empathy can go either way. There's, I'm sure the research on the single identifiable victim effect, where, one poor, starving child can motivate you, right? I think in some of the original experiments, if you're trying to motivate people to make a donation, if you have one starving child, people donate, but as soon as you go to two, the donation per child drops, I think the optimum is 1.2 or something like that. And so that's not what we're getting at. That's sort of like much more emotional. And that's a two-edged sword, because people do that domestically too, right? Sort of, it's pretty easy to say, oh, this person, looks like me, this person's right down the road. You've had some of this come out in the newspaper these last few days, where people are saying, well, look at all these refugees coming in to Europe or whatever, and these look like Europeans, they don't look like Africans or Middle Easterners, so that empathy can pull against universalism, It can also pull towards universalism sometimes, with a single identifiable victim effect. I think that cosmopolitanism is not the same as utilitarianism, the way that Singer and others would make the argument in the effective altruism movement, because it can be grounded in human rights as well as just utilitarianism. But I would say that I think that it does require a certain kind of cognitive empathy, right? It's sort of like, that could happen to me. I can imagine what it's like to be without education, what it's like to be, having bombs fall over me. And so it takes a certain kind of empathy. I think moral cosmopolitanism and even utilitarianism is undergirded by a certain kind of cognitive empathy. And I don't know that emotional empathy and cognitive empathy are like, I don't think you can fully wall them off, personally. And sort of, so while empathy can lead us astray, and I would agree with Bloom, along those lines, it's not, it's not only awful. I think we need some of it in order to motivate cosmopolitanism also.
You mentioned kind of longer term nudges that might be able to, encourage people to act in a more moral cosmopolitan way. Do you think we should be encouraging people to take a more calculative mindset towards thinking about redistributing resources and make it less emotional? Because, if you think of a lot of the ways that charities try to raise money or politicians try to raise support for a cause, they really try to pull on our heartstrings. They use the identifiable victim effect. They have the, people just like you. And, in heartwarming ways, as well as in kind of fear-mongering ways. So do you think that perhaps a longer term nudge would be to try to encourage people to think more rationally about this, because that is potentially going to expand their sphere of make them more likely to make these kind of cosmopolitan moral decisions?
Yeah, I'm on the side of the rationalists on this. I am. I think I think among NGOs, it's almost like an arms race, right? Sort of one NGO puts up, here's a baby seal. No, here's a starving child. Oh no, here's a bomb victim. And it's just like it leads. So I think it leads to compassion fatigue. People get a little bit like, oh my God, and it creates a sense of lack of effectiveness. I think that people think that global poverty is like a disaster. It's like never getting better, because this is what all they see. They see all these images from NGOs saying, here's a poor, needy victim or poor, needy cause. People don't realize that, poverty has fallen dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years. GDP per capita has gone up dramatically in a number of countries. There are a lot of very effective interventions. We're talking about cash transfers, that are available. There are lots of things we can do. But if you're constantly seeing pictures of a poor, needy individual, you lose sight of that. So it's almost like, it's a collective action problem where, like, for any one NGO, their resources go up when you put up this single identifiable victim. But for the field as a whole, it kind of like creates these negative externalities where people become demotivated. So I think, the global development community should back off that. And, I really do believe that there is something to this Rawlsian intuition that we do naturally feel obligated to people we cooperate with, right? So you and I have if we're working together and we have a joint venture and something happens to you, I feel some obligations to you because we're partners, and I think that's what happens in countries. What people don't realize is that we are partners with people in China, right? They're making our Apple iPhone components. We are partners with people picking our coffee, and you have these fair trade movements and things like that, but it hasn't reached the level of politics. It hasn't reached the level of legislation that governs, that forces domestic firms, when they operate overseas, to think of the people they're working with as partners in the way that they would if they were hiring domestic citizens. So I think that sort of idea of collaboration and partnership is crucial, and I think it's sort of partly a rational understanding.
Okay, stepping back and being very lofty for a moment. So if you think of the next generation, how do we, encourage, people going into college and kind of, young generation to, be more moral cosmopolitans? Think of a couple strategies that are out there. That one version would be There's been some people proposing that, every American teenager should have to serve, kind of 1 year in something like the Peace Corps or something, and in order before they go to college. Or if you think of like a lot of countries like Israel, you have to do a year of military service. That might have the opposite effect of you're really thinking about kind of just Israel as opposed to the world. You mentioned things like traveling to different countries doesn't necessarily make you a moral cosmopolitan, but if you were to think of the types of kind of early life experiences that might broaden people's moral spheres. If you could wave a wand and think about redesigning the first year of college education or having one of these mandatory service programs, what might you think would be something good for somebody, say, 17 to 25 to engage in, to kind of have them think more like moral cosmopolitans?
Yeah, that's interesting. So again, just riffing, I don't have data on this, but I do think that early on, I think that reducing prejudice, increasing contact is really important, right? I am a fan of the contact hypothesis. I do think that working, being in the same space under certain conditions, which are, having a joint project and a condition of equality, under a certain kind of authorization, getting people to work together across countries reduces prejudice. And I think that's really valuable. So
it's certainly easier now too. If you imagine you could have people collaborating, digitally across without even having to travel. You don't have to go to Botswana. You can work collaboratively over Zoom like we're doing right now.
That's right. That's right. So I'm all a fan of that. I think though, in addition though, maybe for a slightly older age, I really do think cognitive empathy is crucial, right? And so, that earlier thing is reducing prejudice. That's a young, but when you're older, the circumstances of like, raising kids, this is something, as your first year college student, you aren't necessarily going to relate to directly, but later on in life, there are opportunities to create cognitive empathy in professional settings, which I think are also important. So when I was, going back to my old job at the World Bank, there used to be this program where you do a village immersion program. We'd sort of like go to a village when you first joined, right? Back when there are a lot more resources in the world. You'd sort of go spend a week in a village and kind of, become culturally aware. And people, I think, might sometimes go and have some great food and hear some songs and do some dancing and come home. And that's the end of that, I do think that it's not so much the culture, but the circumstances that you need to sort of like create cognitive empathy for. Like, what's it like to try to get a job in that, environment, or try to even sign up for a program, sign up to get your kid in school, fill out the right forms, like just to sort of go through that process and be in that position. I think that's really crucial.
So if we're thinking now about next steps in the research, would you be looking to move into a field experiment where perhaps you had people collaborate on some type of working group across countries and cross cultures, or what do you think of potentially a design for a field experiment to as next steps for this research program? Yeah,
that's a good question. This is really, it'd be great to validate this at scale in the context of another NGO, of an actual donation, in terms of the durability of it. Maybe a curriculum at school might be interesting. In terms of collaboration, I do think that would be great to see. I have another research. I have another paper I'm working on with some collaborators in Norway, in which we're trying to get at this question of whether collaboration generates obligations, very directly. And we have the lab data to show that it does, but that would be great to take to the field in the way you're describing and see if you create, groups, collaborative groups, some domestic, some international, how that changes behavior and attitudes toward redistribution.
Yeah, because these shorter term nudges are effective and certainly useful from if you're a charity or you're a politician trying to raise support for a given cause. But as you say, they may be short-lived. One first step would be to think of, well, how short-lived are they? If you expose somebody to this messaging, does it really only work for a matter of minutes and then they revert back to their baseline? Or can it work repeatedly as well? If you have charities that are using this message on you, does it work once? and not later. So those could also be interesting directions for this research. But yeah, a field experiment that tries to have a more lasting impact like that. I mean, I suppose that could be done amongst college students in a collaborative course. Could you expand on the work on with your collaborators in Norway?
Yeah, so we basically have people work together or work individually on an online coding task. Working together is a condition of interdependence where you only succeed and you only get paid if everyone in your group succeeds. And then we shock someone in an adjacent group and ask if you want to transfer resources to that group, and find that having collaborated with them increases the likelihood of wanting to transfer resources versus having worked individually doesn't. That's the main finding.
Interesting. And then lastly, Matt Leatherman had a question about how moral cosmopolitanism is compatible or incompatible with different forms of government. So if you think of, some troubling trends in the world right now of, becoming less democratic, more authoritarian, if you're a citizen living in one of those countries, how do you think that might affect people's moral cosmopolitanism? Do you have to live in a representative democracy in order to have these? Or if your country is becoming less democratic, how might you think about that? I mean, given the state of the world, what is your thoughts on how moral cosmopolitanism is compatible or incompatible?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think I can see lots of cross-cutting effects just off the top of my head. One is the effect we discussed about how, if you're feeling poor, you're less likely to be generous globally. So that phenomenon might be going on in some contexts. It's also the case that patriotism may be a social norm. So where people around you are suddenly like pro, rah, our country, you might feel pressure to sort of fall on board. Through the reasoning channel, I can see the opposite effect where what you see in your own country is, the negative consequences of authoritarianism for a variety of human freedoms. And then you can sort of take the reasoning step, well, this is going to be true elsewhere too, and actually could make you more of a liberal. And you see, obviously, if you think of like, all kinds of countercultural literature, the samizdat literature, in Eastern Europe, sort of, Václav Havel types, they're very cosmopolitan people who developed that understanding as a result of watching things deteriorate in their own country. So I think there are sort of different effects, probably for different types of people.
Well, Varun, on that note, we're down to our last minute here. So I just wanted to thank you for leading the webinar today. And for all of the listeners, a full recording will be available on our website on the events tab and a subtab called the Bear Webinar Series. Our next webinar is going to be on April 21st at noon Eastern, and we're going to hear from Neil Anthony Lewis from Cornell University. So with that, thanks very much for attending, everyone. And you can exit this webinar by closing your Zoom screen. And thanks again to Varun.